Welcome to Libeth. The hardest thing for the Victorian reader to understand about Mitford's Japan, the thing that required the most intellectual effort, and that the book does the most work to explain, was not the unfamiliarity of the violence it described. It was the relationship between the violence and the order. In the moral vocabulary that Victorian England had inherited from Protestant Christianity and Enlightenment liberalism, violence was the sign of order's breakdown. It was what happened when the structures of civilization failed to contain the destructive energies of human nature, when law was absent or insufficient, when passion overwhelmed reason, when the social contract was violated. Violence was the negative against which civilization was defined. It was what civilization existed to prevent. The Japan of Mitford's book operated on an entirely different logic. In the world he described, violence was not the sign of order's breakdown. It was one of its instruments. Violence was part of how order expressed, maintained, and reproduced itself. And understanding this difference, not merely registering it as exotic, but actually following its internal logic until its consequences become visible, is the key to reading the book's deepest argument. The institution of vendetta is the clearest example of how this works at the level of formal legal structure. The Tokugawa state did not merely tolerate private killing in certain circumstances. It proceduralized it. A family that had suffered a dishonoring injury, typically the unjust death of a household head, could register a formal grievance with the government, identify the target of their intended vengeance, and pursue that target within a set of rules that specified who was legitimate as a pursuer, who was legitimate as a target, and what conditions had to be met for the killing to be considered honorable rather than criminal. This was not a survival of pre-legal barbarism that the state had failed to eliminate. It was a legal institution deliberately maintained because the Tokugawa system understood that household honor was one of the primary mechanisms of social cohesion, and that a state which allowed household honor to be violated without redress was a state that was undermining its own foundations. The vendetta system was violence in the service of order, private killing, authorized by the state as a mechanism of social reproduction. Its proceduralization was not a limitation on violence, but an organization of it, a way of channeling destructive energy into a form that reinforced rather than undermined the structure of obligation on which the whole system rested. Seppuku occupies a different position in this economy of sanctioned violence, but it serves the same structural function. The ritual execution of the ronin, ordered by the shogun's officials, performed by the condemned men themselves, is not punishment in the sense that Victorian criminal law understood punishment. Victorian punishment was primarily about incapacitation and deterrence. You removed the criminal from society, or you made the cost of crime visible enough to discourage imitation. Seppuku is about something else entirely. It is about the restoration of honor, not merely the individual's honor, but the honor of the entire system of obligation that the individual's actions had engaged. The ronin have broken the law, but they have broken it in service of the law's own deepest values. The system's response, ordering them to die in the form that most completely affirms their samurai identity, is not a contradiction. It is the system performing the most sophisticated possible acknowledgement of its own internal tension. It is saying, you were right and you must die for it, and we are giving you the form of death that makes both of those things simultaneously true. The violence here is not the failure of order. It is the most intense possible expression of it. The attack itself, the 47 Ronin moving through the winter night to the residence of their target, the ceremony with which they organized themselves before the assault, the precision with which they conducted it, the fact that they injured no one who did not have to be injured, is presented by Mitford with an attention to organizational detail that makes the nature of the event unmistakable. This is not a mob. It is a liturgy. The violence has been prepared for years, rehearsed in the mind if not the body, shaped by the requirements of honor into a form as precise and ceremonially bounded as the seppuku that follows it. They send a message to the neighbors explaining what they are about to do and why, so that innocent people will not be frightened, and so that the action will be understood as what it is: the discharge of an obligation, not an act of criminal aggression. They search the residence carefully because the target must be found, not simply attacked. They find him hiding and bring him out. They give him the opportunity to die well, to die by his own hand, in the samurai manner, and he cannot take it because he never understood what it would mean to die well, because he accumulated position without accepting the obligations that position entailed. He dies badly. They kill him. They take his head to the grave of their lord and present it with ceremony. Every step of this sequence is ritualized, and the ritualization is what makes it violence in the service of order rather than violence against it. Remove the ritual frame, and you have a murder. Keep it, and you have the most complete possible expression of what the social order claimed to be about. The violence in the supernatural tales operates at a different register, but serves a related argument. The demons and spirits that appear in the shorter tales are not random threats. They are tests, figures that measure the moral quality of the human beings who encounter them by revealing whether those human beings are capable of the courage, purity, and discipline that the tradition values. The Tengu who teaches martial arts to a worthy student is not simply giving him skills. He is recognizing a quality in him that makes the transmission of those skills meaningful, a quality that connects the individual to forces in the world that respond to genuine virtue. The supernatural danger that the morally serious warrior can overcome and the morally compromised individual cannot is not simply a plot device. It is a cosmological claim. The world is organized in a way that responds to moral quality, that rewards genuine virtue with access to resources beyond the ordinary, that exposes dishonor and corruption to threats that honor and discipline can withstand. Violence in these tales is the meter by which virtue is measured, the test through which the moral order demonstrates its own existence. What runs through all of these different modes of violence, the institutional vendetta, the ritual execution, the supernatural encounter, is a common logic. The ritual frame is what distinguishes meaningful killing from meaningless killing, sanctioned violence from criminal violence, the expression of order from its negation. And this is precisely the distinction that Victorian moral vocabulary struggled to accommodate. Because Victorian moral vocabulary, shaped by Enlightenment rationalism and Protestant Christianity, located the moral quality of an act primarily in the intention and the consequence, not in the form. Whether you kill in accordance with a prescribed ritual or without any ritual at all should not change the moral status of the act. What matters is whether you killed wrongly or rightly, not how the killing was performed. The Japan of Mitford's book says otherwise. Form is not incidental to moral quality. Form is constitutive of it. The way you do something is not merely an aesthetic consideration that surrounds the act, It is part of what the act is. Seppuku is not suicide with ceremonial decoration. It is a completely different kind of act from suicide precisely because of the form it takes. And the form it takes is the thing that makes it morally intelligible as an assertion of dignity rather than a desperate abandonment of life. This is where the second major argument of this video emerges, because Mitford's understanding of what he was doing when he wrote the book down was inseparable from his understanding of what the book's subject was losing. He was watching the Meiji government systematically dismantle the institutional infrastructure of the world he was documenting, abolishing the samurai class, dissolving the domain system, replacing the vendetta with a Western-style criminal code, making seppuku no longer a recognized form of ritual death within a legal framework. And he was doing his documentation during the dismantling. This is not the position of a folklorist recording a tradition in danger. It is the position of someone inside a crisis, watching a civilization reorganize itself under pressure that it has chosen to accept, trying to write down what is being lost before the loss is complete enough to be irreversible. The ethics of preservation, in this situation, are more complicated than they might initially appear. Mitford had the access and the skills to write the book. He had a collaborating network of Japanese informants who helped him identify and translate the sources. He had a publisher and an audience. He used all of these resources to produce a record that has genuinely survived. That is still in print, still read, still the starting point for Western engagement with late Tokugawa culture. In that sense, the preservation worked. The specific tales he collected, the legal essays he wrote, the seppuku account he provided, these exist because he wrote them down, and their existence is a genuine cultural resource. But preservation is never neutral. What Mitford preserved was his version, shaped by his access, which was elite and diplomatic and oriented toward the samurai class, shaped by his sympathy, which was genuine but structured by Victorian categories, shaped by his audience's desires, which determined what he selected and how he framed it. The Japan that was preserved in his book is not the Japan that was lost. It is one layer of that Japan, filtered through a specific observer's specific categories, organized for a specific receiving culture. And because that preservation was so effective, because the book was so widely read and so formative, it became the version of the Japan that was lost that the outside world remembered. The preserved version outlasted the reality it described, and in outlasting it, it replaced it in the Western imagination. This replacement has consequences that extend far beyond the Victorian period. The samurai culture that Mitford documented was itself a highly self-conscious cultural production. The Ronin stories, the vendetta tales, the philosophical elaborations of Bushido that Mitford drew on were already, at the time of their production, the samurai class's idealized account of itself, rather than a transparent description of how samurai actually lived and behaved. Mitford added a second layer of idealization by filtering this already idealized material through Victorian categories that emphasized what was most recognizable to his audience as noble and admirable. The result was a portrait that was twice removed from the reality of ordinary samurai life. And yet this double-idealized portrait became the primary Western reference for what the samurai represented. When Meiji Japan later constructed its own nationalist mythology of the samurai, when the concept of Bushido was formalized and promulgated as the spirit of the Japanese nation, it drew partly on exactly the kind of Western reception that books like Mitford's had generated. using the Western idealization as a mirror in which to see its own tradition more clearly and more usefully for nationalist purposes. The preservation fed back into the thing being preserved, and both were changed by the encounter. What Mitford could not preserve, what no act of documentation could preserve, was the social context that gave the practices their meaning. You can write down the procedure of a vendetta, the form of seppuku, the rules of a supernatural encounter. You cannot write down the lived sense of obligation that made those practices feel like necessities rather than choices. The texture of a world in which the household's honor was a moral fact as concrete, and as demanding as a debt, the emotional reality of belonging to a community whose continuity through time made demands on you that your own death could not discharge. That texture, the felt quality of living inside a system of total obligation, is precisely what was lost when the system was dismantled, and precisely what no book can recover. What Mitford's book gives you is the architecture. The life that was lived inside the architecture is gone, and its absence is the thing that makes the book both valuable and, in the deepest sense, inadequate. Every act of preservation acknowledges the impossibility of what it is trying to do. That acknowledgement is built into the form of the book, into its elegiac undertone, its refusal to verdict, its presentation of a world that it knows its reader cannot enter, only observe from outside, through the glass of a language and a culture that were already, in 1871, watching Japan from a position of imperial advantage that neither they nor the book ever fully examined. The world Mitford documented is gone. The book remains. And the book is the record of a specific encounter between two civilizations at a specific moment. A moment of crisis, of transformation, of the violent reorganization of a social order under pressures it could not contain. Reading it carefully means holding both things simultaneously: the genuine value of what was preserved, and the genuine cost of how it was preserved, and the impossibility of separating those two things from each other. Every page of the book is both a contribution and a distortion, both an act of respect and an act of appropriation, both the record of something real and the construction of something that served purposes the thing itself would not have recognized. This is not a reason to dismiss the book. It is a reason to read it with the kind of attention that takes the complexity seriously, to use it as a lens while understanding that the lens itself has a shape that changes what you see through it. That's all for today on Libeth. One new book every week. At least we try.